A couple of weeks ago, Cristobal Elizondo picked up the theme I focused on in my chapel talk in early January when he spoke at Walker Auditorium. I want to repeat his final paragraph as it is the very essence of what I was trying to get across that first week of the semester. When you take the time to actually talk and connect, it doesn't matter how little you know about each other's culture. In the end, humans are still human, and by far the vast majority of them are loving and good. So I urge you guys, whenever you see someone who's different from you, who comes from a different culture, which you know absolutely nothing about, talk to them, be honest, ask questions, and don't simply ignore the differences. Because in the end, these differences are what make them unique, and they are what make us human. When I spoke in January, I always intended to come back to you with a follow-up talk about friendship, because I have a rather remarkable tale to tell you. This time, though, I didn't come alone. You'll see soon enough why this is a story best told by two people. I'm going to give you a little advice right now at the start. This is a story you want to pay some attention to at the beginning. I'll do my best to lay it out in a way that makes sense to you and is interesting, but if you don't listen at the start of it, you're going to regret it when we get to the crucial turning point. No spoilers, but give me your full attention for a few minutes. You'll appreciate it when the time comes. Sorry, everybody, I'm just looking at the doors in the back, except people are there. In May 2011, so almost 12 years ago, I was returning to Hotchkiss from a visit to North Carolina to see my father, then 80, and for the third time in 2 years in quite shaky hospitalized health. The second leg of my trip was an extraordinarily quick 35-minute flight from Philadelphia to Hartford on a little U.S. Air puddle jumper, as the old slang used to call it. I was making the round trip in a little over 36 hours, but thankfully, my dad had gotten home from the hospital and was in good humor by the time I left. After an anxious month, I was finally relaxed. Sitting next to me in row 18, the last one on the small plane, was a young man, probably in his 20s, who was fidgeting with a smartphone despite its smashed spiderweb glass front. I introduced myself with a quick, "Are you on your way home to Connecticut? Or are you from Philly?" in the hopes of relaxing on the plane with a quick, light conversation. The young man introduced himself to me and told me he was heading to Canaan, Connecticut, which is just a few miles from here on the other side of where Salisbury School is. "Have you ever heard of it?" he asked, almost timidly, but with eyes fixed on mine in a surprisingly sharp manner. I said I had, and that I was surprised to hear that he was heading to my neck of the woods in the northwest corner, as no one I sit down next to on the place to Hartford ever seems to be from anywhere except Simsbury or Bristol or those other central Connecticut suburban towns that I can't really place on a map. I asked what he was doing in northwest Connecticut, and he said he was going to visit his aunt and uncle. This young man was game for a conversation and asked me a steady series of polite but increasingly personal questions. Where are you coming from? How long were you down there? Are your parents retired? Do you have brothers and sisters? Is your dad all right? This was a dream come true. An inquisitive, soulful young man with an engaging conversation style, and not someone who was loading me down with stories about school or some philosopher he just read or some perfect job that he was about to get. We chatted, but also just sat and looked out the window. I started to look at my magazine. This was going to be a light and easy flight. After a few minutes, and just as the plane was about to take off, the young man turned to me and said, "Listen, I'm sorry. You seem like a nice enough guy, and I lied to you before." Something about the way he looked a millisecond before he spoke told me that he wanted this comment to matter, and he looked me in the eye quickly after he said lied to judge my reaction. Not knowing this young man really at all, I thought that it really didn't matter too much that he had lied to me, but he was so instantly earnest and nervous that I thought I should tell him it was all fine, and it was all fine. The intensity of his sudden honesty had knocked me into a new level of attention, and I realized how sweet and friendly this young man had been since I sat down next to him. "I'm not going to my aunt and uncle's," he said plainly. "I'm going to a small mountainside. It's rehab. I've been there before." I was relieved. I had enough experience in my life with people who needed a place like Mountainside that I figured that I knew the right questions to ask and things to say. We had a remarkably frank talk, all in the space of our 35 minutes, seatbelted together, about his family, his father's cancer death when he was 14, his dismal college career, and pretty pretty sure I failed all my classes that semester, he told me later, and his decision to try mountainside again. I don't really know what else to do, he said. When the plane landed, I asked the young man if I could get in touch with him that summer and told him that I'd like to know how it all turned out. He gave me his email address and cell phone number. It doesn't look like it works, but it still does, he had said to me earlier as he showed me his sad phone. I don't know when I'll be done, but please send me an email, he said, with so little guile that I said, of course, with a sudden lump in my throat. We have stayed in touch rather steadily since he moved out from under this hooded umbrella of Mountainside, and I see him a lot. In fact, most of you know him too, and I'm eager to turn this microphone over to him so he can take you through what that day was like from his end. I'll be back in a few minutes with a few more thoughts. But first, let me introduce my friend from that airplane a dozen years ago. Please welcome Mr. Ted Miller.
How's it going, everyone? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mr. Miller. And I imagine many of you may have been surprised that the person Mr. Moon is talking about meeting on that plane 12 years ago was me. It was a moment that forever changed my life, and I'd love to give you a little bit of background about what that day was like from my perspective. I was 23 years old, and I was at the lowest point in my life. For me, this is a time I felt like everyone I knew was finishing graduate school or starting their new dream job, and I was on my way to rehab after spending many years in college and having very little to show for it. How exactly did I end up in this situation? Well, I grew up in a very loving family. I had everything I needed as a kid. I did well in school. I was good at sports, I had lots of friends, and I rarely got in trouble. My life changed significantly during my middle and high school years. When I was in 8th grade, my mom was diagnosed with degenerative disc disease, a spinal disorder which led to a series of spinal reconstructions and significant mobility problems, causing her to spend many years bedridden. A few months later, during the summer going into my freshman year of high school, my dad was diagnosed with sarcoma, an aggressive soft tissue cancer. He underwent chemotherapy for the next 9 months, but it spread too rapidly and he eventually passed away. In a short period of time, I went from having 2 very active parents in my life to having significantly less parental supervision. I'm not entirely sure if this was the cause of the drug addiction I later developed, but I have to believe that it played a significant role. During my high school years, I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. At the time, I thought it was fun and cool. Looking back on it, it was the only thing I knew how to do to cope with the significant pain I was in. What started off as a mild and fun habit turned into a full-blown addiction over the course of the next many years. I knew I needed help, but I had no idea how to do it. Somewhere along the way, I picked up the irrational belief that it was not okay to not be okay. So I kept all the pain and fear I was experiencing to myself, and I pretended I was fine. Whenever friends or family expressed concern, I insisted that I was okay, and I refused to let my guard down. I spent the next 5 years at Michigan State University barely holding things together. Deep down, I knew I needed help, but I also knew that meant facing all the fear and pain I'd been bottling up for so many years. And the thought of that was terrifying, so I kept putting it off. I'm not entirely sure what caused me to reach out to my family and ask for help, but I did. For the first time in many years, I put trust in something outside of myself and decided to get on an airplane and head out to Connecticut to go to treatment. I spent 4 weeks there, got a glimpse of what it looked like to live a healthy life not consumed by drugs and alcohol. It felt amazing and I felt refreshed. After I completed the program, I headed back to Michigan State University. And this meant putting myself back in the exact same surroundings I was in before I left, and it was only a matter of time before my old habits started to creep back into my life. About 6 months later, I was right back where I left off. My addiction was back, and I knew my life needed to change drastically. I decided to go back to the treatment center in Connecticut, this time with the intention of totally relocating my life and starting fresh. Fast forward to that moment on the plane when I met Mr. Moon. I was at the absolute lowest point in my life, literal rock bottom. And as I was sitting in my window seat, I see a positive, upbeat, happy guy who sits down next to me. And the last thing on earth I wanted to do at that moment was spark a small talk with someone on a plane. I silently prayed that he would ignore me. I demonstrated some very disengaged body language. Sure enough, he immediately turned to me with a smile on his face and asked me where I was off to. In my mind, the last thing I was going to tell this man was that I was off to rehab, so I told him I was visiting my aunt and uncle. Awesome, he said in an upbeat voice. Where did they live? The place I was headed to was in Canaan, Connecticut, and I figured there's no way he was in Canaan, a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. So I told him Canaan, to which he replied, oh great, I live in Lakeville, right next to Canaan. What do your aunt and uncle do for work? Maybe I know them. What a nightmare. And And I started squirming a bit, because I had clearly not thought this out very well. And I replied with, I don't really know, to be honest. He then asked, well, what are you guys going to do in Canaan? There's not a lot going on there. I again replied, I'm not really sure. I guess just hang out. In my mind, my story was rapidly falling apart, and this guy was going to figure out exactly what was going on. In trying to change the subject, I started asking him questions, and he began to tell me about how he's a teacher at a boarding school, and all about his amazing wife and his 2 sons, and about the remarkable students that he gets to work with every day. I think during this conversation, I realized that he had what I wanted so badly but did not have: a happy, meaningful life. And at some point, I realized how kind he had been during this entire conversation. And I'm not really sure why, but in a manner that was totally uncharacteristic of how I've been living my life, I just decided to tell him the truth about where I was going. And the moment I told him, it instantly brought our conversation to another level, as I began to basically spill my heart out to him. And the irony of this all is that after hiding every piece of my personal life from literally everyone in my life, the first person I really opened up to was someone I had known for 15 minutes on a plane. And it was a moment that would forever change my life. Mr. Moon asked if we could stay in touch, which I agreed. After I completed 6 weeks at the program, I got back in touch with Mr. Moon. And as he is going to explain, our friendship turned into something incredibly meaningful for the both of us.
In August of that year, I did call Ted to see how things were going. We agreed to go out to lunch. You're going to go out to lunch with some dude that you met on a plane on your way to rehab. His roommate Chris said that with a clear shock in his voice. Guess we'll be reading about you in the newspaper tomorrow. And our conversation picked right up from how it had gone on the plane. Over the next few months, I got to know Chris and their other roommate Colin, and followed their progress as they moved from the temporary post-rehab housing on the mountainside campus to a small town near Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I knew I couldn't go back to Michigan, Ted told me. I would just fall back into the same trouble. Ted got himself a job at the Kripalu Yoga Center in Massachusetts and started going back to school. First at Berkshire Community College, where he immediately earned himself a couple of A's, and then got himself into a degree program at UMass. His real aunt and uncle had come to his rescue with some money, and he was finally able to exhibit the remarkably sharp and excellent mind that had been so clouded by alcohol and drug use for almost a decade. I started having dinner with Ted here at Hotchkiss, where he would come to play in an adult hockey league on Monday nights. As we got to know each other better and better, he told me about his plans for graduate school, jobs, and most importantly about his girlfriend Michelle, whom he hoped someday to marry. He knew he didn't know much about adulting, and that he had spent a lot of his life avoiding tough questions about what was coming next instead of tackling them or asking for help. That was over now. He understood that if he trusted people, especially when he didn't feel particularly confident, he would get help. Slowly but surely, and in what now seems like a very quick 5 years or so, Ted accomplished it all. He aced graduate school and his internships. He interviewed at Hotchkiss and got the job. And in one of the truly magnificent events of my life, not to mention theirs, of course, he asked me, a justice of the peace here in Salisbury, to marry him and Michelle, which I did on July 1st, 2017. They now have 3 beautiful little girls, all of whom were born while they lived in Coy, just as my 2 sons were born while my family lived in that building decades before. This is a miracle story, and it's been playing out quietly right before all our eyes for several years now. These stories don't always end so well, and no one knows that better than Ted and his friend Colin. The third roommate, Chris, relapsed with drugs after 8 years of sobriety, and he died in Boston in 2019. Instead of allowing that to break the them, Ted and Colin redoubled their efforts to preach the good word of a drug-free life to anyone and everyone that would listen to them, working with recovering addicts even while getting on with other jobs. Sometimes the simplest advice they give is what Ted exhibited so courageously on that plane 12 years ago. Tell someone the truth and trust that they will help you. Secrecy, lies, and shame are the enemies of progress and success, but they're so hard to get rid of if you're trying to do everything by yourself. Vaping, tobacco, drugs, alcohol, negative issues with all of these things usually start when people are your age, and most of you know what that looks like right now. It's worth remembering that adults are not the enemy of this. We've just seen more of what can go very, very, very wrong. We want to help you make the choices that will help you in life, not hurt you. Ted and his friends have pulled me along on their path. I decided to give up any use of alcohol of my own in July of 2011, mainly for the simple companionship with Ted that started on that plane. I promised myself, no one else except my wife really knew it, that as long as Ted stayed sober, I would too, completely. So far, so good. Ted renews me every time I see him. He's so confident now, and much less afraid of his own vulnerabilities, but every conversation still blows through me with the same connection and intensity that I experienced that first time. He's moving on with new friends and new plans all the time, but he keeps a special place for me somewhere inside himself, which I never fail to notice. I hope he never fails to notice what he means to me as well. I'm so deeply proud of Mr. Miller that I'm not sure I can adequately express it, but I always wanted to know it. Here's Mr. Miller again, this time to take us to the end.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. These past 12 years have been transformative for me, and thinking about my life before I got sober almost feels like a dream, like another lifetime. I want to finish out this chapel talk with a few things I learned during this time. The first thing that comes to mind is a quote that I used to see every day on the wall when I worked at Kapala, the yoga retreat center that Mr. Moon recently referenced. It said, "Always be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle." This idea is something I relate strongly to. Whether your challenges have been with drugs and alcohol, whether they're related to issues of body image, insecurity, issues with your own identity, whatever they are, all of us are human, and all of us are walking down our own unique paths with our own unique challenges. And these challenges present differently for everyone, and at different times in our lives. During some periods of our lives, they're more mild, and at other times in our lives, they're more severe. And on the outside, we never really know what someone else is going through. In my case, I was so good at hiding my struggles that very few people had any idea what I was going through. And most people, aside from a very, very select few, assumed I was living a happy, fulfilling life. But I wasn't. I was fighting a relentlessly hard battle. So please, always be kind with everyone you meet, because I can assure you that in their own way that is unique to them, they are fighting their own battle, and they could use your kindness more than they could use your judgment. The next thing I'd like to share is the idea that it's okay to not be okay. As I previously mentioned, I had learned the exact opposite of this. I believed that the feelings I had were not okay, and that it was not acceptable to struggle with something like drugs and alcohol, or really any mental health challenge. So if it was not acceptable, how could I ever tell anyone that this is what I was dealing with? My solution to this was to make sure no one knew it existed, to pretend everything in my life was perfectly fine, and obviously it didn't go so well for me. And I've since learned that I can make mistakes, and I don't need to be perfect, and that actually I already am perfect the way that I am, all of my shortcomings and flaws included, just like each and every one of you. For so many of us, the expectations that we have for ourselves are so high. We feel we need to get into the best school, get the best grades, get the best job, that anything aside from perfection, who we are, is unacceptable. And this is so far from the truth, and it hurts my heart as I see so many people struggling with this just as I did. Believing they always need to be the perfect student, the perfect friend, the perfect son, the perfect daughter, that they can't have struggles, and that they can't make mistakes and mess up. Life can be really hard, and it is so important to honor and acknowledge this. And acknowledging our struggles requires vulnerability, which can be scary. But being vulnerable is not a sign of weakness. Being vulnerable is the ultimate sign of strength and courage. As Brené Brown has said, there is no such thing as courage without vulnerability. And lastly, I'd like to share the message that we can't do this alone. We need other people. And being able to put your trust in another person and be vulnerable with them can be the scariest thing on earth, and it can also be the most rewarding thing you can ever do. My ability to be vulnerable is the basis of the strongest relationships in my life. The incredible relationships that I developed with my friends Chris and Colin, who Mr. Moon mentioned, were cultivated because we came together at the lowest point in our lives and were able to be entirely vulnerable with each other. And had I not opened up to Mr. Moon in that moment on the plane, I would not be here today. Our conversation would not have gone to the level that it did, and we would have both went our own separate ways, and I probably would have never been known what Oscars was. My marriage with my lovely wife Michelle, my 3 beautiful daughters, and the abundant life I have today would all probably not exist. It's a wild thought for sure, but it just goes to show the power that can happen when you let other people in and risk being vulnerable. So be brave, even in the moments that are scariest to you. It's completely worth it. Thank you everyone for listening, and have a good day.